She was 22 years old, and everything she owned in the world fit inside a canvas pack that sat light on her shoulders, because there was almost nothing in it. A change of clothes, a wool blanket, a beeswax candle stub, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of chamois leather, a draw knife with a handle of figured maple, worn smooth in the places where a man's hands had rested for 30 years. That draw knife was the only thing anyone had ever given her that meant anything, and she had $3.40 in her coat pocket, which was the sum total of what remained after the train fare from Sudbury to a town so small it didn't appear on the map she'd bought at the station. The town was called Heron's Flat, and the reason we're telling you this story, the reason it has stayed with us, is not because of what happened to Rosalind Wick when she arrived there with almost nothing. It's because of what was waiting for her. Not luck, not charity, something older than both. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us start where the story starts. Rosalind Wick was born in the winter of 1931 in a company town outside Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of town that existed only because of the mine and would eventually die with it. Her father, Edmund Wick, had worked the nickel shafts for 18 years. He was a quiet man, meticulous in the way that men become meticulous when their work offers no room for error. He kept his tools oiled and his boots resoled, and his accounts in a small red ledger that he updated every Sunday after church. He was not a man who talked about love. He showed it by checking the laces on your boots before you walked out the door, by leaving the lamp burning when you came home after dark, by teaching you things that would keep you alive after he was gone, which was a kind of prophecy he did not know he was making. He was a woodworker in the hours outside the mine. Not furniture, or not only furniture. He built things from what the land offered. Chair rungs and axe handles and sled runners, and when the mood took him, small figures carved from birch, animals and birds, and one time a woman's face that everyone said was Rosalind's mother, though he never confirmed it. His shop was a lean-to against the back of the house, and it smelled of fresh shavings and linseed oil, and the particular dry cold of unheated wood in winter. He began teaching Rosalind to use the tools when she was 11, not because he thought it appropriate, or because her older brothers showed no interest, though both things were true. He taught her because she was the one who came and stood in the doorway and watched, and eventually that watching became a kind of asking. And he was not a man to refuse a sincere question. He showed her how to read the grain before you made a cut, how to let the tool do the work and not force it, how a good edge was more important than a strong arm. And by the time she was 15, she could shape a chair leg on the shaving horse with a draw knife in the time it took him to drink a cup of tea. He gave her his own draw knife on her 16th birthday, the one with the maple handle. He said it had come from his own teacher, a man named Auguste Pelletier, who had built half the houses in the Sudbury Basin before his hands gave out. He said the knife knew good wood from bad and would tell her if she listened. She wasn't sure what that meant at the time. Later she understood he was talking about feel, about the way a tool that has been used well for a long time becomes an extension of attention itself. Edmund Wick died in the spring of 1949 when a ventilation failure in the north shaft sent 3 men home in boxes. Rosalind was 17. The mine paid the widow's settlement in a single check, and the company supervisor came to the door with his hat in his hands and said all the things that people say, and Rosalind stood behind her mother and watched him and felt something go very still and cold inside her chest, the way a lake goes still before the ice sets. Her mother, Vera Wick, had always been the more sociable of her parents. She had friends and opinions and a laugh that filled a room. But grief changed the shape of her. Not immediately. It happened the way a house settles, so slowly you don't notice until a door no longer closes right. Within a year, Vera had sold the woodshop tools, all but the draw knife, which Rosalind had hidden under the floorboards of her room, and taken in a boarder named Clement Bray to help with the rent. Clement Bray was 48 years old, a mine administrator who wore a collar even on Sundays, and had the particular manner of a man who considers himself reasonable while systematically making life unreasonable for everyone around him. He was not violent. He was something quieter and harder to name. He had a way of making you feel that your presence in any room was provisional, that you were, at best, a problem that hadn't yet been formally addressed. He objected to Rosalind's work, to the smell of shavings, to her hours, to the fact that she took commissions from neighbors for carved spoons and tool handles and small repairs, which he said was not appropriate for a young woman living under his roof. When Rosalind's brothers, both older, both gone by then, one to the West Coast fishery and one to a farm in Manitoba, sent money home at Christmas. Clement managed the accounting. When the mine offered Edmund's former co-workers a small survivor's pension, it came addressed to Vera, and Vera handed it to Clement to deposit. Rosalind tried once to speak to her mother about it, carefully on a Tuesday afternoon when Clement was at the office. Vera listened with her hands folded in her lap, and then said that Clement was doing his best, and that things were complicated, and that Rosalind needed to understand what it was to keep a household running. It was not cruelty. It was exhaustion that had learned to look like acceptance. Rosalind did not argue. She had her father's draw knife and a mind that knew how to measure and plan. And she understood that some doors, once they have closed in a particular way, are better walked away from than forced. The morning she left was a Thursday in October of 1953. She was 22. Clement had told Vera the previous evening, in a voice just loud enough to carry through walls, that he had arranged for Rosalind to take a position in a textile factory in Copper Cliff. He presented it as a decision already made, as a favor. Rosalind had not been consulted, because in Clement Bray's understanding of the world, consulting her was not a necessary step. When she came downstairs in the morning, her mother was at the kitchen table with her coffee, and could not meet her eyes. Rosalind packed what she needed in 20 minutes. The draw knife in its chamois, the blanket, a change of clothes, the candle. She took the $3.40 that she had saved from her last 3 months of work, which was all she had been able to keep out of the household account that Clement administered. She left the room neat, and she left the house without waking anyone, which was not an act of cowardice, but of finality. There was nothing left to say that would change anything. And she had learned from her father that energy spent forcing a thing that will not move is energy taken from the thing that can. She walked to the station. She bought a ticket for the furthest point she could afford, which turned out to be a flag stop in a part of northern Ontario she had never visited, on a rail line that served mostly lumber contractors and the occasional supply run for remote communities along the shore of Lake Nipissing. The conductor told her, without being asked, that Heron's Flat was the last stop before the line turned back south. He said it in the tone of a man who wanted her to reconsider. She did not reconsider. Heron's Flat in the autumn of 1953 was not much. A grain elevator that had not stored grain in 8 years. A post office inside a hardware store. A church. A school with 2 rooms. A handful of houses on unpaved streets where the mud was deep enough in spring to swallow a boot. And a general store run by a woman named Cecily Drummond, who was 63 years old, stood barely 5 feet tall, and missed nothing. Cecily looked at Rosalind the way you look at something that has arrived out of season. Curious, but not unkind. She listened to Rosalind explain that she was looking for work and a place to stay, and she asked 3 questions. Could she lift 50 pounds? Could she drive a wagon? Could she do anything with her hands besides carry things? Rosalind unstrapped her pack and took out the draw knife. She set it on the counter. Cecily looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Rosalind's hands. Then she said there might be something. There was a property, Cecily explained, about 6 kilometers north along the lake road. It had belonged to a man named Samuel Hoke, who had built it as a fishing and hunting camp in 1921, and had expanded it over the years into something closer to a small homestead, 2 cabins and a workshop and a root cellar and a dock on the lake. Samuel Hoke had died in the spring without a will, or none that anyone had located, and he had no family that anyone knew of locally. The county had assessed the property for outstanding taxes, which came to $4.50 for the last 2 years. If someone paid the tax arrears, the county was prepared to transfer the deed rather than absorb the cost of managing an unclaimed rural property. It was not a sale, exactly. It was the county resolving a paperwork problem. Rosalind had $3.40. She looked at Cecily Drummond and said she was $1.10 short. Cecily looked at her for a moment, and then reached under the counter and produced a small tin box, from which she extracted $1.15 in coins, which she set on the counter between them, and said that the extra 5 cents was for Rosalind's coffee, which she hadn't offered yet, and that there were worse ways to invest in a neighborhood than keeping it from being repossessed by a county office that would only let it rot. We want you to hold that image for a moment. A woman with almost nothing, and a stranger who made the almost into enough. Because that exchange, $1.15 in coins on a worn counter, was the hinge the entire rest of this story turned on. The deed transfer took 3 days, during which Rosalind slept on a cot in the back room of Cecily's store, and ate what Cecily put in front of her, and listened to what the older woman told her about Heron's Flat, about who was who and what mattered and what didn't. On the third day, Cecily drove her out along the lake road in a truck that had once been green and was now mostly rust and determination, and they came around a bend in the birch trees, and the property opened up before them. It was not grand. We want to be clear about that. It was not the kind of place that photographs well, or that anyone would have described as beautiful in the conventional sense. The main cabin was a low structure of squared timber with a cedar shake roof, and about a quarter of those shakes had curled and lifted and let in the moisture of 2 or 3 wet seasons. The second cabin, smaller, which had served as a bunkhouse, was sound but dark, with 2 of its 4 windows covered in boards. The workshop stood a bit apart from the cabins on a slight rise, and it was in better shape than either, because Samuel Hoke had apparently spent more care on his workspace than his living space, which told you something about him. The dock needed rebuilding from the waterline up. The root cellar had a door off its hinges. The outhouse leaned slightly eastward in a way that invited caution, but the timber framing of the main cabin was old-growth white pine, and old-growth white pine does not surrender easily to time. Rosalind walked the perimeter and pressed her palms against the walls, and felt the solidity beneath the weathered surface. She climbed a wooden ladder to check the roof ridge and found it straight and true, the ridge beam a single run of timber, mortised into the gable ends, with the kind of joinery you only see in work done before the war, when people built to last because they did not know any other way to build. She stood in the workshop doorway for a long time. There was a shaving horse, a workbench with a wagon vise, an adze hanging from a peg, drawers of hand-cut wooden pegs and square nails and bits of iron banding. The floor was packed earth, swept clean, and in the far corner, a small cast-iron stove with a pipe that needed new sections, but was otherwise intact. She walked back to the truck where Cecily was waiting and said she wanted it. Cecily did not say "I told you so," which Rosalind appreciated. She moved into the main cabin that same afternoon with her pack and her draw knife and the blanket and the candle stub, and she spent the first night listening to the lake through the gaps in the roof shakes and thinking about everything that would need to be done, not with dread, but with the particular pleasure of someone who has spent their whole life wanting a problem big enough to deserve their full attention. She began on the roof. She had watched her father repair the lean-to roof twice and had helped the second time, and she understood the logic of it. Working from the eaves up, pulling the damaged shakes and replacing them course by course so each new piece sheltered the edge of the one below. She did not have cedar, not yet, but she found a stand of eastern white cedar at the back of the property, tall trees that Samuel Hoke had never touched, and she felled 3 of them with a bucksaw she found in the workshop and split the bolts with a froe and a mallet and made her own shakes over 3 days, which was harder than buying them and better than waiting. It was on the second day of roofing, when she was up on the ridge in the gray October cold, that a man appeared at the edge of the tree line and stood watching her. He was perhaps 65, with a white braid down his back and a canvas coat so old it had gone the color of bark. He watched for a while, and then walked closer and looked at the shakes she had split and said, in English with a cadence that made each word deliberate and precise, that she had split them correctly, which he seemed to have expected might not be the case. His name was Joseph Makwa. He was Anishinaabe, from a community 15 kilometers north along the lake shore, and he had known Samuel Hoke for 30 years, which was complicated, he said, in ways he didn't explain immediately. He had come to see who had bought the property, or paid the tax on it rather, which he understood was not quite the same thing. He looked at Rosalind's hands and at the draw knife where it hung from her belt and said, "You know wood." She said she was learning. He said that was the right answer, and that people who said they knew wood usually didn't. Joseph Makwa came back the next day with a piece of birch bark folded over a quantity of venison jerky, which he left on the workshop step without ceremony. The day after that, he came and watched her work the shaving horse for an hour without speaking, and then showed her a different angle for the draw knife on green cedar that gave a cleaner pull. He showed her once and did not repeat himself, which was the way her father had taught, and which she understood to be a form of respect. We should tell you about the workshop, because the workshop is where this story turns. It was on the 9th day, when Rosalind was cleaning and cataloging what Samuel Hoke had left, sorting tools by condition, oiling what could be saved, setting aside what could not, that she noticed the workbench. Not the surface, which she had already cleared, but the base. The front left leg, nearest the door, was slightly shorter than the other 3, and someone had compensated for this not with a shim, as you would expect, but by setting the leg on a flat stone, a piece of local granite about the size of a bread loaf that sat in a mortised recess in the earth floor. The recess was just slightly larger than the stone, which meant the stone could be lifted. Rosalind knelt on the packed earth floor and looked at it for a long time. Then she took her draw knife and used the flat of the blade to work around the edge of the stone, clearing the packed earth from the joint, and she got her fingers underneath and lifted it. Beneath the stone was a space lined with pieces of scrap tin, soldered at the seams. Someone had built a box in the ground and fitted the stone as its lid. Inside the tin-lined space, set on a piece of folded oilcloth, were two things. The first was a tobacco tin, the round, flat kind. She pried it open and found it packed with banknotes and coins. She counted them on the workbench, in the gray morning light, coming through the north window, counted twice because the first count seemed wrong. There was $320. This was not a fortune by the standards of cities. In Heron's flat in 1953, it was 18 months of careful living, or a new roof with materials to spare, or the start of something that could sustain itself. The second thing in the tin-lined space was an envelope, water-stained at one corner but sealed, with nothing written on the outside. She set the money aside and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written on 2 sheets of brown paper in a hand that pressed hard into the page, the writing of someone who had learned late and was determined not to lose the skill. It read, "My name is Samuel Hoke. I am writing this in March of 1953, and I do not know how many more marches I will have. I came to Heron's flat in 1921 with a kit of tools and not much else, and I built what I built, and I am not sorry for any of it. I never married. I have a brother in Windsor who I have not spoken to in 20 years, for reasons that are mine to keep. I have no children. What I have is this property and the savings in this tin, which is not much but is what honest work looks like when you add it up slowly over 30 years. I am not leaving this where someone in a county office will find it. I am leaving it for whoever comes here with the intention of staying. If you are reading this, you have already lifted the stone. That means you looked carefully enough to see that it was there. That means you are the kind of person who knows how to look. I think that is the right kind of person for this place. The workshop is sound. The shaving horse was made by a man named August Pelletier, who worked out of the Sudbury Basin. He gave it to me in 1938 when his hands failed him, and he could no longer use it. I do not know if that name means anything to you. Use this money to finish what needs finishing. Repair the dock, and you will have the lake. The cedar stand at the back of the property has never been logged. Joseph Makwa's family has gathered medicines there for a long time, and they should be allowed to continue. If you are not the kind of person who understands that, please put this letter back and close the stone. I hope you will stay. This place gets into you if you let it. The winters are long but honest. The lake is cold and clear and full of fish, and it does not care who you are or where you came from, which I have always found restful. Make something here. That is all I am asking. Make something and let the making be enough." Samuel Hoke, written in his own shop on a cold morning. In March, Rosalind read it once, and then she sat down on the shaving horse and read it again. By the time she reached the end of the second reading, she was not crying exactly, but something had loosened in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. The tightness of a person who has been holding themselves together through will alone, who had not had permission until this moment to set any of it down. August Pelletier, the man her father had named, the man whose draw knife she carried in the chamois leather at her belt. She sat very still for a while. She looked at the shaving horse Samuel Hoke had kept, the one August Pelletier had built and used and passed on. She looked at the draw knife her father had given her, the one that had come from Pelletier's hands before his. She thought about what it means when the tools of one life find their way into the hands of the next, and about how that chain of passing, hands to hands to hands, is not random, but not exactly planned either. It is something in between, something that requires the right person to be in the right place and paying attention. She went to find Joseph Makwa. She walked the lake road north for about 2 kilometers before she met him coming toward her, which did not surprise her, because she had already begun to understand that Joseph Makwa was the kind of person who knew what was happening in his neighborhood without being told. She showed him the letter. He read it without expression, then handed it back, and said that Samuel had been a difficult man in his youth and a better one later, and that the bit about the cedar stand was true, and that he was glad it was written down. She asked him what she should do first. He said the dock, because the ice would come in 6 weeks, and a dock half repaired was worse than no dock at all. And he said, He would show her how to set the crib in the house, which was a different technique than anything she would have learned in town, because the lake bottom here was rock and silt mixed, and it required a particular way of setting the crib stones so that the spring ice out didn't heave them. They rebuilt the dock in 4 days. Joseph brought his nephew, a young man of about 20 named Leon, who said almost nothing and worked with a focused efficiency that reminded Rosalind of her father. On the last day, Cecily Drummond drove out with a pot of potato soup and 4 bowls, and announced that the dock looked better than it had in 15 years, which she said as a fact, without sentimentality. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Rosalind had not known she was missing. She worked on the cabin in the mornings, chinked the gaps in the timber walls with a mixture of moss and clay and wood ash that Joseph showed her, replaced the 2 boarded windows with glass she ordered through Cecily's store, rebuilt the bunkhouse door, and rehung it on new hardware. In the afternoons, she set up the workshop properly, brought her own draw knife to work beside the tools Samuel Hoke had left, and began taking in work. Chair parts first, because the farms around Heron's Flat all had chairs in need of new legs or rungs or seats. Then a set of wooden sled runners for a family 2 farms north. Then a small cabinet for the school. She charged fair prices, the kind that assumed the customer's dignity, and she kept her accounts in a red ledger, which she had bought in Cecily's store, which was the same color as her father's. A woman named Pearl Sugru, who farmed half sections of oat and barley east of town with her husband, Roy, appeared one morning with a broken axe handle and a jar of pickled green beans and the information that her husband's plow blade needed straightening, which wasn't woodwork, but she thought Rosalind might know someone. Rosalind said she could do it if Pearl had a forge. Pearl said Roy had a forge. Roy came by the following week with the plow blade and stayed for 2 hours learning how Rosalind managed the draw knife on curved work and left looking thoughtful in the way of a person who has seen something they intend to remember. A man named Fletcher Goff, who ran the small Anglican church, came by not about the church but about a desk he was building for his son in Timmins and couldn't get the drawer slides to run smooth. Rosalind showed him how to plane the runners with the grain, not against it. He came back 3 weeks later with a jar of honey and the news that the drawer ran perfectly and that his son was very pleased. Leon, Joseph Makwa's nephew, started coming by in the evenings after his own work was done, not asking to be taught but watching and gradually helping, the way Rosalind herself had once stood in a doorway and watched, and she recognized the shape of that request and did not refuse it. She showed him what she had been shown, not all at once, but in the order in which things make sense, which is the only way knowledge of that kind transfers. The first snow came on a Tuesday in November, early and decisive, covering the ground to the depth of a boot sole overnight. Rosalind woke before dawn and looked out at it through the new glass of the cabin window, the lake beyond pale and flat, the birch trees edged in white, and felt something she did not have a word for at first. Then she understood that the word was home, not the home of childhood, which you don't choose and which is given and then sometimes taken, but the home that you choose with your hands and your attention over weeks of work that leave marks you can see. That kind of home is yours in a way that nothing which is given can quite be. She lit the stove. She made coffee. She sat at the table her father saw would have recognized and opened her red ledger and looked at the numbers, which were modest but honest and pointed in the right direction. She thought about Edmund Wick, who had given her the draw knife and the understanding that good tools and good attention were enough. She thought about August Pelletier, whom she had never met, whose hands had shaped the shaving horse she worked on every day, whose knife she carried. She thought about Samuel Hoke, who had hidden his life savings under a workbench stone and written a letter to a person he would never know, trusting that the right person would be curious enough to look. She thought about her mother, Vera, still in Sudbury, still in the house that smelled of Clement Bray's pipe tobacco. She found she could think about her without the sharp edge that the thought had carried all autumn. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but understood in the way you come to understand a person when you are no longer standing inside the shadow they cast. Her mother had been afraid, and fear had made her practical in the worst way, which was the way that lets someone else make the decisions. That was a grief, but it was her mother's grief to carry. Rosalind had her own life to build. She did not think about Clement Bray. He had no place in the rooms of her mind. A mind, like a workshop, has limited space, and you have to choose carefully what you keep in it. By December, the main cabin was weathertight and warm. By February, the bunkhouse was habitable, and Leon spent 2 nights a week there, rather than walking home in the dark. And on those evenings they ate together and talked, or didn't talk, with the ease of people who have built something together and don't need to fill the quiet. By spring, when the ice went out and the lake turned gray-green and restless, and the first geese came over in long, uneven lines above the water, Rosalind had 4 regular clients, a waiting list for chair work, and a reputation in Heron's Flat for doing what she said she would do by the time she said she would do it, which is rarer than you'd think, and more valuable. The cedar stand was still standing. She had walked through it twice in the winter and once in early spring, and she understood why Joseph's family had gathered there for generations. The trees were enormous and quiet, and the light came through them in a particular way, slow and green and filtered, like light through deep water. She put nothing in her plans about that piece of land, except the note in her ledger that said what it was, and who had a long relationship with it, and she intended to keep that note true. On an evening in late April, when the ice had been out for 2 weeks, and the lake was beginning to warm at the shallows, Rosalind carried a chair out to the dock. The chair had been the first piece she had made entirely herself from Heron's Flat timber, a simple ladder back in white ash with a woven cord seat, and it was not perfect, but it was honest, and it stood solid on the dock boards without rocking. She sat in it as the light went gold across the lake and watched the loons come back. The first pair of the season, black and white against the gray water, making the sound that carries so far in still air. It seems to come from somewhere beyond geography. She had the draw knife on her lap, the maple handle warm from her palm. Her father's tool in her father's hand's memory, passed from one set of hands to another across 30 years and 200 kilometers and all the particular distances of loss and departure, until it had arrived here on this dock, on this lake, in these hands. She thought about Samuel Hoke's letter, about what he had said. Make something and let the making be enough. She thought she understood now what he meant. Not that making was sufficient as a consolation for everything that had been lost, but that making was its own form of answer to the question the world asked when it took things from you. Not a rebuttal, not a revenge, an answer in a different language, the language of wood and edge and grain and time. Rosalind Wick was 22 years old when she walked out of her family's house in Sudbury with a draw knife and $3.40 and the particular determination of someone who has been underestimated for so long that it has stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like information. She spent that money, along with $1.15 borrowed from a woman she had met that same morning, on an abandoned homestead at the edge of a lake, so far north it barely appeared on the maps. She found $320 hidden under a workbench stone, and a letter from a man she would never meet, who had trusted that the right person would come. It was the best $4.55 anyone ever spent. And here is what we want to leave you with, because we think about this whenever we tell this story at Cabin Stories. Samuel Hoke did not know Rosalind was coming. He could not have. He built something, and he worked at it honestly for 30 years. And when he knew his time was ending, he trusted that what he had made was worth finding. He trusted that someone would come with eyes to see it. Is there something in your life, a place, a skill, a relationship you've been neglecting, that is waiting for exactly that kind of attention? Not rescue, just someone who will lift the stone and look.